Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Hey guys, my name is Nick. I recently started working at a homeless shelter here in New York City. I have today off, so I decided to try and chronicle some of my paranormal experiences I've had there. Whether or not you believe any of the events I mention or discuss does not concern me. I'm really just looking to vent. It's weird because before this, I've never had a job where I brought home odd emotions from work. I'll admit most days, everything goes along as smoothly as can be expected, but certain days really knock the wind out of me. I've also found that working nights really do not help. My schedule varies based on how often the shelter requires me. Most of the time I get my schedule a week in advance, with only a few exceptions when they are short on staff or when a colleague is suddenly out sick. I've mentioned to my manager that I'd prefer not working night shifts, though he's yet to really get back to me on it. Some nights are worse than others. I suppose it really depends on who's staying for the night. We have regulars, but there are always drifters too. Anyway, as I mentioned, this is a relatively new job. I've only been working for about 4 months. It's an easy commute for me, although I really hate taking the subway at wee hours into the night. Of the 4 months I've worked there, I've had about 3 really weird experiences. Before I get into it, I'd just like to say that it's been and is a really rewarding experience. I get shit pay, but sometimes the homeless really make you feel needed and wanted. They compliment you sometimes, which really helps when you're knee-deep in grief or just plain having a bad day. Okay, so on to weird experience number 1. This happened back in March, when I initially started the gig. I was a newbie and people either picked up on it real quick or knew from word of mouth. Around that time I got picked on a lot, either by the staff or the resident homeless there. They'd expect me to do shit tasks, and the homeless would be really pushy and ask for more food than they were really allowed. It was around that time I met Shirley. It's strange because at my homeless shelter, there's actually more women than men there. The men are segregated into different wings of the shelter, but they convene for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Anyway, Shirley did not look like your average homeless person. She wasn't gorgeous or anything, but she didn't look fucked up either in the face or body. Appearance-wise, I probably wouldn't be able to tell if she was homeless or not if I had just met her. Okay, so regarding Shirley, it was apparent that she was homeless since I would be serving her breakfast on the days that I worked mornings. I've never served her lunch or dinner before. Sometimes the homeless make small talk when they wait in line for food. I often hear them discussing things like where the best places are to find soda cans or bottles, or where to find a good sleeping spot, etc. One night, I was working the late shift. I overheard a discussion on Shirley and how she's never been to the shelter for dinner, and for whatever reason she's always there for breakfast. A logical person like myself, I simply assumed that she might have simply just gone elsewhere to eat. But homeless person has said that he's seen her come back to the shelter covered in blood, sometimes at odd hours like 3 or 4 a.m. Homeless person B. Ken, I know his name, said that he's seen Shirley out by Central Park at mostly sleeping under an overpass. Intrigued by this, I asked Ken on a few occasions to share some of the odd things he's encountered. One day he told me that Shirley might not be one of them. So basically Ken tells me that Shirley might not be one of them. One of them has many implications. Thus far, most of my conversations with Ken have been pretty lucid. You see, Ken, along with most of the homeless population at the shelter, suffers from mental illnesses or overt drug use. Ken, along with a few others, were lucky enough to get government-funded treatments. And I give him a lot of props for taking the extra effort of meeting with a counselor for getting and staying medicated. He told me that he wanted to get well so that he could see his family again someday. I pry a bit more information from Ken regarding Shirley, and I'm told that she might not be suffering from any illnesses or drug use. She does, however, act real strange sometimes, like sneaking back into the shelter at late hours, and she often keeps her things locked up with several locks topped with red and green ribbons. How does Ken know this? I haven't a clue. Men aren't even allowed on the same wing as the women. What initially drew my attention to Shirley was that no matter how hot it was inside the shelter, she's never worn anything that didn't cover up her entire body. Now granted, it could be a deterrent from getting assaulted or harassed by the men in the shelter. She's usually been a loner and hardly ever talks to anyone. considering that this is a shelter in Midtown New York City. It gets rather crowded no matter what time of day it is. I've seen Shirley sit at crowded tables silently eating breakfast while others chatted away about miscellaneous stuff. She's never looked anyone directly in the face either. She appears to be suffering from some sort of low self-esteem problem. Anyway, regarding her attire, she normally wears either one of two outfits: long-sleeve shirt with long old-fashioned dress or a sweater and long pants. I made two assumptions based on her attire. Either she was really shy and wanted to protect herself from being attacked, or she was trying to cover track marks. But Ken confirmed that both observations were false. He told me that he knows for a fact that she's never done any drugs and never been attacked in the shelter. Granted, attacks, abuse, assaults, etc. do happen from time to time. The staff here at the shelter are pretty quick to act on such activities. We usually have our fingers on speed dial for the police station and the hospital. Apparently, Shirley's been coming to the same shelter since she was about 13 years old, according to rumor. She looks about my age, around 26 or so. According to Ken, she might have even been in the shelter a lot longer than that. Ken told me that he's known about Shirley since he started coming to this shelter, and that pretty much everyone who is a regular knows of her or about her. Some have speculated that she's a relative to one of the staff members at the shelter. Nobody has ever heard her speak, but they all seem to know that she wanders around Central Park during midday. She carries around a notepad in her pockets and scribbles in it often. When people try to talk to her, she never responds. All signs thus far seem to just make her a hermit. Nothing paranormal or special, right? One morning I was mopping up the food hall along with a few volunteers when one of them noticed a black notepad. It looked like a moleskine but no hard shell. He asked me what he should do with it, so I offered to take it to the lost and found, knowing full well that it belonged to Shirley. I'd seen her scribbling in it before from the serving area. Once all the mopping was done and the coast was clear, I took a peek into the notepad. In it were names, in a very feminine and organized handwriting. It was really weird because after flipping through about 3 or 4 pages, I found my name, phone number, and address listed in the notepad. It was one of those reporter-style notepads. Confused and a little weirded out by this, I decided to confront Shirley about this, keeping in mind that she and I have never talked before, and I don't make it a habit of giving out my personal address to homeless people. Anyway, the next morning shift that I worked, I finished serving everyone and walked over to her table. I introduced myself and explained that I had found her notepad and I wanted to know how and why she had my number and address listed in her notepad. For the first time ever, she raised her head and looked me in the face. I noticed that one of her eyes didn't match the other. It was like one eye had a larger than normal pupil. One eye was brown and the other completely black. Kind of gave me goosebumps just thinking back to her. But her face was actually quite appealing. Amazingly, she had smooth skin and no blemishes. Suddenly, she grabbed the notepad from my hand and walked off. Ken wanders over after observing the whole incident. He tells me that she's only looked one other person in the face before and that guy no longer worked there. Apparently, there was some altercation. The previous guy that Shirley had made face-to-face eye contact with was apparently stabbed by her outside of the shelter. He tried to press charges, but the shelter settled the claim. Supposedly, Shirley was the daughter of one founder of the shelter. When Ken told me this, I was a bit freaked by it. Nevertheless, I usually keep a blade, everyday carry item, on me anyway. Sure enough, that night on the same day, Shirley jumped out of the pitch-black corner of the street just past the shelter. She had something hard in her hand, rather than be responsible for hurting a woman. I decided it was probably best to avoid contact with her, so I started to run in the opposite direction. I swear it felt like a live-action Gargoyles episode. The faster I ran, the more I noticed her catching up to me. I found my way onto a street with a pub at the corner. I ducked it into the pub and called the cops on my cell phone. When they arrived, I explained everything to them. The cop said that there wasn't much he could do since there were no witnesses and or any threats made. We talked a bit more outside and one cop was sent to look around the nearby areas for a woman matching the description I gave them. No one was found, so nothing else happened. I decided to take a cab home that night, but having someone know my address wasn't a very settling feeling. When I got home, I made sure no one had been in the house and I tried to make sure that no one was getting inside the house. I had the following 2 days off, so I stayed home keeping on high alert. My next work day, I tried to see if Shirley had shown herself at the shelter. Ken and a few others told me that she hasn't been at the shelter since I tried to talk to her. I didn't want to spook anyone, so I didn't mention the being chased part. That night, I was mopping the hallway when I heard a door creak. So when I turned around to see where the noise came from, it was a maintenance room down the hall. I could see someone's eyes peering out from the dark room. I immediately grabbed one of the phones by the wall, alerting security. You guessed it. It was Shirley. This was about 12 a.m. or so. And when they apprehended her in the women's wing, her shirt was bloodied up. I was told it wasn't her blood. When they carried her out in twist ties, it was the first time I had heard her scream. She wasn't screaming any words. It was just a really loud shriek. Nobody's heard or seen her since. But I was told that her notepad had the names, address, phone numbers of just about the entire shelter. They also found codes in the back of the notepad that seemed to indicate intent to kill. No further explanation was given to me.
I dig the story, man, but I'm not seeing the paranormal angle. So far, we just have people who likely have some serious mental problems acting like people who likely have some serious mental problems.
That's the strange part. Nobody had spoken to her at the shelter. There's no directory of the sorts. At least not for low-level workers and homeless people. 1. How'd she get those numbers, addresses, etc.? By all accounts, about 4 or 5 homeless folks. Shirley did not suffer from any mental illness. Granted, she was very reserved and kept mostly to herself. It was strange of her to become so physically violent. Also, I had not bothered to look at the back of her notepad, but apparently there was some kind of written code that she had plotted to hurt the people listed in her notepad. You might have thought that Shirley was the only resident that caused a situation in which I had to run. As I mentioned earlier, most of the homeless population at the shelter suffered from some form of mental defects. Another such person was Timmy. Nobody at the shelter knew Timmy's real name. Someone who worked at the shelter before me came up with this name. The way it was explained to me was that he either thought the guy had a childlike face or that he overheard him say the word Timmy. Whichever the case may be, it stuck and they've been calling him Timmy ever since. There were a few striking qualities of Timmy that I noticed immediately upon meeting him. 1. His face really did have a sort of baby face quality. It doesn't appear to be a physical deformity or anything, just that he had chubby fat around his cheeks, making him look much younger than he probably was. My guess was that he was in his early 20s, probably younger than me. One staff member told me that Timmy was actually in his 40s. I don't know whether or not this is true. While we try to keep surveys of residents, we don't officially keep any kind of documentation. Some of the homeless at the shelter are not literate. 2. His voice is fairly young, like that of a child. You know how your voice changes after a certain age. Timmy sounds like he hasn't gone through puberty yet. Reminds me of that witch doctor woman from the movie Poltergeist. Almost sort of funny because you can never tell if Timmy was being serious, mad, or just joking around. 3. Timmy seemed normal most of the time. This doesn't mean that he doesn't throw fits every once in a while. I've only witnessed 2 incidents where he really went off the deep end. One time was during lunch, when he smashed the person's face who was sitting next to him with the metal food tray. I wasn't told, nor was it ever explained, what was said or done to provoke Timmy. The second time was at night. I was once again mopping the halls, this time on at the men's wing, when out of nowhere, I saw Timmy peeing on the walls. I kept yelling that the bathroom was just down the hall, but he seemed to be ignoring me. It was something Timmy should have known anyway. I suspect he was either sleepwalking or lost control of himself, because afterwards, he simply walked back into the sleeping area. 4. Timmy was pretty tall. Not Yao Ming tall, but a good 6 feet 8 or so. When I am on duty for cleaning, I much prefer mopping and cleaning the women's area. They are slightly tidier than the men, and there's really much less drama that happens there. Overall, they mostly keep to themselves, and there's rarely a time when I actually come into contact with them. When the lights are out, they are usually rather quiet. The opposite is true in the men's wing. I'll be completely honest here. I've heard and seen grown men cry, being mugged. I've reported about 20 or so incidents since working there. Yes, sometimes there is assault. Other times I find that at night it's when the real nutjobs go insane. More often than not, someone will either scream or do something disruptive near or around midnight. The men, however, are usually somewhat self-governing. If a resident is awoken in the middle of the night due to some mentally ill person screaming, two things will usually happen. 1. The screamer will get his ass beaten by the people sleeping around him. 2. It provokes others to join along. Silly, I know, but I've been at the shelter a few nights when all I heard at 2 a.m. in the morning were grown men screaming. Back to Timmy. He was not an antisocial kind of person. In fact, he's made quite a few friends, including staff at the shelter. On the few occasions that I've talked to him, he seemed like a pretty chill kind of guy. Apparently, he works as a cleanup crew for Central Park, picking up trash and stuff and getting paid wages to do so. Most people have nothing but good to say about Timmy and describe him as just a guy down on his luck. I'm guessing the parks department doesn't pay well enough for Timmy to own or rent his own place. Although, there are others who say that Timmy is putting on an act. I'm still not 100% sure either. One morning, April 9th, as I was arriving at the shelter, I noticed Timmy sitting outside, one hand holding up a napkin to his nose and the other fidgeting. I was mumbling something that sounded like numbers. Kind of reminded me of Rain Man. He was also rocking back and forth while doing so. I tapped him on the shoulder and asked if he was all right, but got no response. It was like he zoned out or something. I tried to listen to him. It sounded like he was repeating the same sequence of numbers 8, 14, 15, 31, 50, 56, 48. I thought that it was a telephone number at the time, but it was simply too many digits. Not thinking much of it, I went inside and told one of the volunteer social workers about it, and was told that this was actually quite normal. Timmy usually started off the days rocking back and forth. They were a little concerned about the nosebleed, but Timmy liked numbers, letting the whole thing slide. I went on with my day but couldn't stop thinking about those numbers. 2 days later, it was my off day and I was out at a diner having dinner with my girlfriend at the time. I was telling her about all the weird people at the shelter, when the subject of Timmy came up. She seemed pretty interested, so I went on about how appearance-wise, he was a pretty normal kind of guy. One would never assume he had problems. I started to explain that I caught Timmy spouting out numbers and that it was odd and I couldn't decipher it, or understood whether or not it even meant anything. Just then, I looked up at the TV above the food counter and noticed the winning lottery numbers. 8, 14, 15, 31, 50, 56, 48. Nobody won it. And what really surprised me was that I found them on the New York Lottery website confirming it. Needless to say, whenever I had an early shift, I would check to see if Timmy was out front chanting numbers again. I've only seen him do this 2 other times. Both times the numbers didn't seem to make up anything. 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, and 54. 32, 84, 24. After a while, I started seeing less and less of Timmy, until one day I was told to clean out his stuff. Apparently he suffered from some kind of brain aneurysm and had passed away. I found a duffel bag like the ones in the military, dark green with the name tag Smith embroidered on it, along with some of the other stuff Timmy kept in a mason jar with coins, and 2 jackets. It didn't smell any worse than most of the stuff people brought into the homeless shelter, so I didn't think much of it. But when I opened it, I saw everything from dead pigeons, dead squirrels, and dead rats. They were all dried corpses, but the sight of it was enough to induce vomiting. There were maggots crawling all over them. That was it, the end of the second story. I came across this duffel bag full of maggots crawling around filled with dead animals. Since Timmy had passed, we basically just chucked the duffel bag in the incinerator. The managers tried posting his matching description into a database so that if he was a missing person, someone or his family might have closure. I'm still debating whether or not I should post the third story because it's sort of in the process of legal issues. Not really sure if I'm allowed to post it. I'm really not sure if I want to go ahead and recount the last incident. There might be some legal repercussions if I do. I think it's currently being investigated. Nothing to do with lawyers or anything yet. What's worse is that homeless shelters in general sort of breed crime and are almost designed to handhold and sometimes even hold people back from progress. The shelter that I work at, I know of a few volunteers that will sometimes beat and even steal from the homeless. It's sad, really. It often leaves me to ponder whether or not some of the people we cater to are induced into mental illness rather than walking into the shelter with original problems. Vessa was an incredibly delicate person when she arrived at the shelter. I could sort of tell that she had only recently become homeless. From her age, I could surmise that she was either a runaway or that she might have been kicked out of the house. Either of two weren't very optimistic options. Vessa wandered into the shelter wearing what you'd expect of a homeless person, but it was weird that she mostly stuck to herself. She was also very polite, always saying thank you and please whenever food was served to her. But you could tell from her voice that she'd been hurt in the past. She also had a habit of praying before every meal, so I assumed she was Christian. I've witnessed more than one occasion where she sat sobbing at the table. It really breaks your heart sometimes when you see people down on their luck. Like I said, Vessa was really fragile. Sort of druggy type thin, but you could tell that she wasn't using. It was almost like forced starvation. As a side note, this is exactly why I don't think it's right that we send money overseas when we have starvation problems here in the US. One day, I had finished serving food early, so I walked over and talked with Vessa. I asked her if she wanted to share her story with me. She told me that she was being followed and that she was trying to get away from someone. That she'd actually been train hopping all over the country, from as far west as Oklahoma. I tried to inquire more about who was following Vessa, but she wouldn't budge. I think she said it was more than one person, but couldn't get into specifics. I didn't feel like prying too much since I could already see her eyes swelling up. I hate it when girls cry. She explained her logic. She figured a big city like New York would make things harder for the people trying to find her in the crowd. It wasn't until I saw her reach for the milk cart that I noticed healed cut marks all over both her forearms. From the striations, it seemed like defensive wounds rather than something self-inflicted. When she noticed that I saw them, she quickly covered them up, giving up on the milk. Vessa was pretty smart for someone in her teens. She understood proper etiquette and had amassed a small stash of souvenirs from various states she'd been in. She had these thimbles, each with the names of different towns she'd visited. Over the course of a week, she got more and more comfortable with telling me things. Often I'd pass along whatever I could find out to the social workers on call. The social workers, mostly post-college volunteers, were fat and lazy. They wanted nothing to do with this sort of information. So the response I got often was, since she's more comfortable telling you these things, just try and get more information from her. I'm gonna go get some donuts. Vessa liked talking about the good parts of towns and how fortunate she was that God blessed her, because sometimes she'd come across perfectly good food that expensive restaurants had thrown out. She said that she must have done something to make God angry because he sent them, the people following her, to punish her. Up until the end of the week, I saw no indication of anyone really following her aside from the wounds on her arms. I assumed that perhaps she came across some unlucky incidents in some town somewhere. But one day she showed me a picture that someone had taken of her. She was posing in front of some water fountain. She pointed out that the man in Wayfarer sunglasses and fedora hat was following her. She said that there were more of them. Then she started showing me picture after picture of the same person in various states, all in the background of the photos. I told her that this is probably something we should show a caseworker. They might be able to protect her. She quickly yanked the photos out of my hands and said to drop it. I assumed it was out of fear that it might bring unwanted attention to her. I tried quickly to change the subject so that she wouldn't linger on the thought of me disclosing the information to social workers. But it was too late. She soon became more and more withdrawn from making small talk. I think in the back of her mind she was already plotting to head to another town. She had mentioned to me once that she'd try to get to Canada if she could. But she didn't have a passport. Instead of letting this case slip through the cracks, I decided to try talking to a social worker one last time before going to the cops. Sadly, it took getting police involvement. 2 days later, a police officer did arrive at the shelter. He had with him a camera, so I'm guessing he took a picture of her to scan their database. I wasn't working that day, so this information was pretty much secondhand. They also took her to the precinct to obtain more information. For whatever reason, they brought her back to the shelter and decided to do more investigating on their own end. When I finally went back to work, Vessa was no longer interested in chit-chatting with me, but I did notice that she was slipping the food into her pockets, a good indication that she was probably preparing to leave soon. At the end of my shift, I stuck around in hopes of talking her out of skipping town. Just as I was heading towards her quarters, I noticed 2 men in lieutenant trench coats headed in the same direction. Since I didn't recognize them, I asked them for identification. Usually, only staff are allowed on certain floors. One of them showed me his badge. The other disregarded me completely. I asked him if there was anything I could do for them. He said that they were there to arrest a suspect in a murder case and that I should probably not get in their way. I stopped in the hallway and observed. He used twist ties and cuffed Vessa. She looked too frightened to really react or say anything. I called out to her but no response. One of the officers told me that her name wasn't Vessa and that it was Marcia. She was wanted in 3 states. I really couldn't comprehend this, since she was this weak and delicate person. If anything, she'd be a victim, not a perpetrator. I asked if there's anything I should contact, like her family or friends, but the cops completely ignored me. They were just about near the exit, hauling Marcia out. It wasn't until they got into the car that I recognized that one of the men. He looked exactly like the person she had shown me in the pictures. It was at that point I saw Marcia's face at the patrol car window screaming out for help. I quickly ran out the door and mentally noted the car number and license plate. They sped off, confused and unsure what had transpired. I called 911 and asked about the car number and license number. Both were apparently bogus, and that I was to wait at the shelter for a police officer to question me. When the real officer arrived, I was told that Marcia was indeed the correct name of the person, and that she'd been sent to a halfway house in Arkansas because both her parents were killed in a double homicide. When she lived with her uncle, he'd assaulted her, and that's when she ran away from home. She was later located and placed in a halfway house, but it had burned down. She was presumed either dead or missing. They couldn't identify the corpses. I felt like I was in the middle of some action movie. It was information overload. But then I remembered that all her belongings were left behind when the fake cops hauled her away. There had to be pictures of the creeps that took her. So I offered to show the officer pictures of the real criminals. He explained that there was some suspicious information in her records, saying that Marcia was actually unaccounted for in a brief 2-year period between the time she was with her uncle and the time she was relocated to a halfway house. No documentation was mentioned. Only a small note indicating that she stayed with a Christian organization known as Children of God. We, the officer and myself, rummaged through her backpack in hopes of finding the pictures she'd shown me, but they were gone. All that was left was some manuscript, pamphlet about God and whatnot. It had some blood stains on the back, and curiously scribbled on the front cover was the words, "Christ forgive me, for I am born of impurity." It looked like Marcia's handwriting. The officer took it in for examination and has yet to get back to me. He did ask if I knew anything else, but I detailed everything I had learned about Marcia through our little talks. The officer did tell me that these events happen every few years. They're not clear on who these criminals are, but there's been more than one of these cases left unclosed. I did do more research into this and found that Children of God was a real organization, but due to some fucked up things they did, they later renamed their organization X Family. Some considered it a cult. There's actually a few celebrities like Rose McGowan that were born into the cult. Most have said that their experiences with them have been really sick. I would have had I known what exactly was happening. I still keep an eye out when I'm working at the shelter to see if Marcia has ever returned. Homeless shelters usually encounter fed up stuff every now and then. Most people only see the facade of an organization doing goodwill, but honestly all sort of messed up things happen there. Probably not as wacky as an asylum, but pretty high up there.
You'd better be fucking telling the truth, because if I'm all worked up with worry over some fake Vessa, I'll be pissed. That X-Family cult is horrendously fucked up and almost impossible to escape.
Yeah, there's really nothing much that can be done at this point. All resources have been attempted, but they haven't found her. From what I understand, the X-Family has literally thousands of locations throughout the world. They might have easily transported her elsewhere. The only caveat is that she didn't own a passport at the time I met her. But then again, you don't need a passport to cross over south of the border. You definitely need one to get into Canada. Try not to think about it too much. All that could have been done is being done regarding this case.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember that all videos have been archived on the Odyssey page.